This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, is our nation's medical research agency. They turn new discoveries and scientific advancement into actual health, into actual practices, approaches, and actions that help us to live healthier, happier, longer lives. Dr. Thomas Insel led the National Institute of Mental Health from 2002 until 2015. This essentially means that he was America's psychiatrist, our top scientific mind for mental health science. It was his job to keep tabs on the direction of mental health in America, as well as the direction of scientific discovery, and help lead our research community's efforts to make sure science is actually optimized to help people. The position he held was similar to Dr. Anthony Fauci, except for mental health instead of infectious diseases. We talked to him about what's actually happening to America's mental health today. What are the trends impacting our lives, and how is our healthcare system addressing them or not? As an accomplished neuroscientist and psychiatrist, he shared a lot of insights with us, and we hope you learn as much from it as we did. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with real audience questions. For information on how to join us, past episodes, and more, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode this Friday, featuring Michael Oren, who's the former ambassador of Israel to the United States. Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led the interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about mental health? Can you tell us maybe what are the differences between the severe mental illnesses that we hear about and also the moderate mental illnesses? What are some of these conditions and experiences that people have? The groundwork for how we can explore this further.
Absolutely. It's a good place to start. So they're really probably best to think about two different versions of the same problem. One version is people with what we call severe or serious mental illness. Sometimes that's abbreviated just SMI. And that includes a range of problems. Most people with schizophrenia, bipolar illness, severe depression, sometimes PTSD, sometimes even severe anxiety disorders would fall into this bucket. And what we mean by SMI is that these are people who are really disabled. They're unable to work, often end up in being institutionalized or homeless. And best estimate is there are about 14 million people, about 1 in 20 Americans would fit into this category. I spend a lot of time talking about that group of people, not because they are so prevalent, but because they are so poorly treated in the current American I'm actually reluctant to call it healthcare system. It's hardly a system. But in terms of where someone with schizophrenia or bipolar illness is likely to get engaged today with care, it may more likely be in the criminal justice system. The other piece of this whole mental health issue is, of course, the far more common mental disorders that all of us struggle with at one time or another. And I do mean just about all of us. It's a rare person who hasn't experienced severe anxiety or depression. And we may be challenged, but we continue working, or we continue taking care of our family, or we find a way to sort of cope with that. And that is another set of problems, far more common.
So, Tom, I read your book, Healing Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health. In the book, you mentioned a statistic. I believe it's the 40-40-30. There's a lot to that, but 5% of people that seek treatments, get treatments, go along the program to being treated, become, I don't know if it's cured or their illness is put into remission. I was wondering, is that 5% stat for the people who have severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia? Is it a combination of the moderate stuff like anxiety that I deal with? And what does the 5% look like?
So let me break that down really quickly. That 40-40-33 idea it's a little complicated, but it doesn't need to be. I was just trying to make the point that in contrast to many medical problems, there's a real problem in the mental health space around engagement. A lot of people who could or should be in care aren't getting care. We think about only about 40% of people who would benefit from mental health care get it. That's pretty different than the world of infectious disease or cardiology or oncology, many other parts of medicine where people generally who are sick get care, and the sicker they are, the more likely they're going to be in care. This is actually the flip side of that. Sometimes the more severe the problem, the less likely you'll get help for it, for a lot of reasons. For those who do get care, the quality's not great, and that's where the next 40% comes from. Only about 40% of people get what we would consider to be adequate, scientifically based care. And then of those, about a third will get what we call remission, a complete resolution of symptoms. A third are sort of half better or somewhat better, and a third may not respond for a whole range of reasons. So that's, if you do the math, you end up with like 5 to 6% who are actually getting the kind of outcome that you'd hope for. What does that look like? Well, it's, in one sense, in a kind of medical sense, that outcome is the resolution of symptoms. It's remission, and that's fine, I think, for some people. There are a lot of people, particularly those who have serious mental illness, who need something more than that. You can give them medication for their hallucinations, but what they need is a life. I mean, these are people who have they've veered off the path of development. Usually, I should say this, most mental illness starts before age 20, or certainly before age 24. So for people who have psychotic illnesses, again, this is in that SMI category, that usually starts by age 19, 20, 21. They don't finish school. They don't develop relationships or families. They really are challenged. And what they need is quite a bit more than medication. I mean, they need really the support to fully recover and begin to thrive. And the reason I wrote this book is that they don't get that. We know what to do. We know how to help people kind of get back on track. And it takes time, and it takes a comprehensive approach, and it takes a lot of compassion and patience. And we don't provide that. We should, but we don't most of the time.
You make the case that I think you said it's not a mental health care system, it's a sick care system. And I was wondering if you could first describe that, and then we'll get into the comprehensive approach. What is a sick care system as opposed to a mental health care system?
Well, yeah, that's what you and I experience all the time. So you get into healthcare or sick care in the United States because you've got symptoms, you've got a problem. And it's often when the problem gets to be really acute, and then you've got a crisis. And then you're dealing with this in an emergency situation, kind of episodically when it flares up, and you get something to treat the symptoms and to resolve the crisis. And then you go back to whatever you're doing. So it literally is a system that's built to deal with sickness. A health care system is something very different, where you need to start thinking about what leads to health. And it's much, much more than just reducing symptoms. This is like, and I have to say, I didn't understand this when I started the book. So the reason I wrote the book was I was just so confused about a lot of this. And I was so fortunate to run into people who were much wiser and had thought about these problems. One of them was a guy named Don Berwick, who he's a sort of iconic figure in medicine. He's written more than almost anybody about how do you improve the quality of healthcare. He was actually, under President Obama, he was the head of the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. But what he's taught me was that when we talk about health, we have to talk about a lot more than health care. That if you look at outcomes for people like life expectancy or employment or a whole range of other outcomes that you might care about, that healthcare itself only explains maybe 10 or 15% of the variability in outcomes. It's got a lot more to do with where you live, who do you live with, how you live, not so much, what medications you're on or what clinic you go to. In fact, he makes the argument that we really need to reframe what we mean by health care to begin to take all of those issues into account.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is very real. People who experience trauma of any sort, whether it's military service or a traumatic event, can have flashbacks, can have extreme stress and anxiety responses that are far beyond what anybody who's never experienced that kind of stress can experience.
So like flashbacks, does it take them back to where they were, actually?
In some cases, the flashbacks are literally that. Takes them back to where they were. They lose track of their actual present situation. Sometimes it's just an extreme anxiety that is not really consistent with what you're actually experiencing at that moment.
Data from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs shows between 2001 and 2019, almost 2,600 Hoosier vets took their own lives. That's how many vets in Indiana have been lost to suicide. It's critical that mental health care through the VA is readily available to vets here in Indiana.
There are reasons, though, to doubt that it is.
My father was a Vietnam veteran, had PTSD and debilitating mental health issues. Circumstances wound up where I was just graduating college from, a blue-collar family, so I couldn't take care of my father, but he wound up being homeless for a couple years, and he was a 100% disabled veteran. So my uncle and I tried to go through the VA system, and there was no comprehensive approach to deal with even veterans who were 100% disabled from serving our country in war. The government just essentially left them on the side of the road to be homeless, Republicans and Democrats alike, and then what happened was when he finally got into a halfway house, the mental health physicians at the VA in Maine that he went to basically drugged him up and made him comatose in a way that he wasn't able to live life. So long story short, because there was no comprehensive healthcare system and because the politicians that claim to care about our veterans did not care, they just say they do for votes. My dad was one of these people with an SMI that fell through the cracks. So I had to take him in, and he moved in with me in when I was in DC, and we worked on a whole bunch of things. But just going through that opened my eyes to how our system fails. Even our veterans, never mind people that didn't serve the country, that have these illnesses, drug dependency, alcoholism, and wind up on the side of the street. So I was wondering, could you go into the comprehensive approach that you're advocating for, not for the healthcare system necessarily, but for the mental healthcare system? You argue that we need not only a change in first responders to deal with people having mental breakdowns in the moment, but you also argue that we need to provide housing, we need to provide routine, we need to provide treatment, and then social support to patients. So I was wondering if you could kind of quickly go through that and maybe focus on both the routine and social support aspects, because I think people may not know about those.
Yeah, well, so first, Justin, thanks for sharing that. And if you don't mind, I'd love to use your dad as an example, because sadly, he's not unusual. I wish I could tell you that, he was the exceptional case, but unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of veterans that have gone through the same experience. And for someone like your dad, they need a lot more than what the kind of care system as we define it now provides. And I focus it on what I call the 3 Ps: people, place, and purpose. That for someone like your dad, he's going to need help with his PTSD, but he needs a lot of other things. He needs social support. He needs someone that cares about him and who he cares about. Someone who's watching his back. Somebody who's who's there for him when he needs that helping hand. And we know that people with mental illness, one of the most debilitating parts of it is just the pure loneliness, this sort of isolation, social isolation they experience, which keeps anybody from being able to thrive. The second P is place. That, as you said, people need housing. And I'd love to think of a time when a healthcare provider could write a prescription for housing the way they write a prescription for Prozac. And then the third P is the one that we almost never talk about, but it's because it doesn't fit in with our idea of healthcare, but it's so vital. It's this idea of having purpose. There was a guy named Viktor Frankl who wrote a wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning. This was maybe 50 or 60 years ago. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he was talking about how he got through the concentration camps. And what he says is that if you have a why to live, you can survive almost any how. You need a purpose, you need a mission, you need something to live for. And we just don't think enough about that. So those three P's, people, place, and purpose, I think are kind of the essence of what we need to start providing when we think about care. And really care for someone like your dad who's not going to get better with some pill. It's more complicated than that. He's got demons that he's really going to have to master and overcome. And it takes the three P's for that to happen. It takes time. It takes an investment. But the book is actually really hopeful because it works. We do see people recover. We see people who get a life and who thrive and who then can pay it forward to help the next person. And that becomes part of their third P, part of their purpose, their mission, is to use their experience to help other people along that same path. And that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I could provide, his VA benefits could provide the house as long as I helped him find it. And then I'd move in with him to provide some of the care, get him to his treatments. But the purpose as, not a mental health professional was extremely difficult. And I think everybody can understand you can get somebody to treatments, you can help them take their medication, you can even spend time with them, but it's like impossible if you're not a mental health professional, from my personal experience, to literally give somebody purpose. You have a lot of people who try and live vicariously through their kids. That, even in a lot of cases, isn't a true sense of purpose. So I was wondering, could you go into what that third P, the purpose, would look like from a system-wide approach? What would, like, going to the doctor to get your shot of purpose in a hopeful and not a condescending way, how could my dad have gotten his shot of purpose in your model?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got the full answer to that yet. It's a really interesting question to ponder, and maybe other people will have thoughts about this. I spent yesterday at a place called Community 43 in Phoenix, Arizona. It's one of about 300 clubhouses, that's what they're called, that have been developed to help people find purpose, people who are largely disabled by severe mental illness. And I'm on the board of the original clubhouse called Fountain House in New York City, which started 75 years ago to do exactly that. And what they do, I mean, it's actually all three of the P's. People spend all day there. They get the social support. It's a safe place for them. They get really good food. It's like they're very obsessed with nutrition and all of those issues around health. But the purpose part they're working on is in everything from job training to helping people with artistic expression, helping people launch musical careers. They've actually created a kind of interesting business where they have large garden outside this place that people work in. And they've developed a stand at the farmers market in Phoenix where they can sell stuff that they grow. They also make this amazing granola that they have a stand in the farmers market for. It's not, it's not developing software and hardware, although honestly, some of the people that I met yesterday have been software engineers, so they have an amazing range of skills before they got sick. But they're giving people those stepping stones to creating jobs, to creating relationships, to creating a sense that they can do something that others will value. And there are lots of places doing this around the country. We spend $3.5 trillion on healthcare, on emergency rooms and surgical suites and hospitals. And places like the one that I went to yesterday, they're basically, they're selling granola to survive. They're holding bake sales to try to keep the doors open. And yet they're doing incredibly important work, which is probably as important as anything that we do in our hospitals to ensure that this population of people can actually thrive, can actually recover.
So, Tom, we're going to turn to the research aspect of this. Your institution that you worked for so long has a major research component. And we've talked a little bit here about how some of these mental health conditions, a lot of experts don't think that there's really a silver bullet towards curing them, that other kinds of treatments are often the most appropriate and effective approach. So as we approach research, can you tell us about what we're hoping to discover and what we think might be on the horizon? What are the big breakthroughs that we're waiting for that you think might become possible through research?
Yeah, well, I don't know that there's a magic bullet coming. I think for a long time, a lot of us hoped that genomics, which is such a powerful technique and continues to generate even more powerful techniques like CRISPR, we thought that would really make a difference. And then with the power of brain imaging, a lot of us think about these disorders as, in some ways, they're brain disorders. They're problems with the way your circuits are firing, because after all, they're mental disorders, and the mind is the functional side of what the brain does. So it made some sense to look in the brain for where the problems might be. I guess I'd have to say that is still a noble quest, but I don't think at this point it's given us what we were looking for. And part of what we were looking for was to try to validate this kind of medical model, which means that we needed to do a better job on diagnosis. And what we had hoped was that the research would begin to break down the current diagnostic categories into something that had a little more scientific validity to it and would be able to lead us to better treatments. There's a sort of, a little bit of an adage in clinical research that the road to better therapeutics runs through better diagnostics. If you can get really precise diagnoses, then you can do a better job on treatment. It's not always the case, but sometimes it works really well. It's certainly been the case for breakthroughs in cancer. So I think NIMH logically kind of followed wherever there was the most scientific traction. And for much of the last 20 years, there's been a lot of traction really in three areas, I'd say, in genomics, in imaging, in neuroscience. And the third area is in cognitive science, understanding more about how we think and how the brain actually categorizes the world, and how we how our minds are biased in very specific ways. So there's been a lot of really great science about that. What it hasn't done is to really deliver on the needs of people, particularly those with the most serious forms of mental illness. We haven't really seen breakthroughs, as far as I can tell, in either on the diagnostic side or on the therapeutic side. There are advances, there's progress, and I would argue that in some areas of medicine, we've really had breakthroughs that have just, made a profound difference. For so long, AIDS was a fatal diagnosis, and today it's a chronic disease. It's still not quite curable, but it's definitely treatable. But in the case of mental illness, I don't know that someone who has bipolar illness or schizophrenia, I'm not sure that they're that much better off today than they would have been 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
It's estimated almost 1 in 5 adults has some form of mental illness, yet less than half received mental health services.
I was realizing how many people wanted access to this information and how many people wanted to explore themselves.
The American Psychology Association developing guidelines for its members and social media.
Therapy is when you've got sort of an ongoing health professional relationship with an individual.
The American Psychological Association advises that people find a provider with appropriate credentials who provide service based on sound research practices and who you can contact in a crisis.
It has taken me, 20, 30, 40 hours of research to try and find a therapist just in Washington, D.C., whether the online systems are confusing because of insurance and everything else, and I have a good insurance, whether it's the background research or going and trying to meet these professionals, or they're just booked up for months in advance. So I was wondering, do you have any views on how to improve our normal therapist, psychiatrist system for people who are actually capable of getting the care themselves so that they don't feel it's going to take a week's worth of research and effort to just go see a doctor?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is you probably don't need to go see anybody because there's, so much is available now through teletherapy, and the convenience and access problems have largely been solved by startups that have hired hundreds, sometimes thousands of therapists, trained them up, and made sure that they'd be available to see someone not with a 10-week waiting list, but maybe 10 minutes or sometimes maybe 10 hours. That said, what you're looking for is somebody who's really going to be able to help you with your anxiety. And it's sometimes hard to tell. It's hard to know what it is that a given therapist is able to do or where their skill set might be. Some of the better startup companies, and I call them startups, but some of these companies are now worth billions and billions of dollars. These are huge. Some of the biggest mental health companies in the country are really those that are online. Some of them have done a great job, I think, of improving, of sort of transparency, helping you to select of the 50, if you want an African-American female over the age of 40, you can find that person. It might be really hard to do if you're in Washington, D.C., looking through the Psychology Today catalog, which is the other way to do this. You can go onto Psychology Today and see who they have in their registry. But or you can go to your insurance company, but very likely that there's no one within network who's got available hours to see you. So I do encourage people to at least explore what may be available online. There's a whole range of companies. Some are direct to consumer, some are done through your employer, but many of them have really transformed the experience of trying to get therapy by giving consumers a lot more choice, a lot more clarity about what's available. Sometimes you still have to pay out of pocket, which is a bummer because it's healthcare. But it is getting easier. We've got a lot. I always say this, that fixing this problem is probably a play in 5 acts, and we're in Act 1, and Act 1 is about moving people from brick and mortar to online and making sure that any of us would have easy access. But Act 2 has to be about improving quality and we haven't really done that yet.
The question I have has to do with the oft-cited meme of it's not your genetic code, it's your zip code. And what I'd like to hear your thinking on, Tom, is, there's contributions of the zip code that cause people to suffer from poor access to poor health care. But there are many reasons that people end up in that zip code, often mental illness itself. So I'd love to hear how you differentiate the role of zip code from social determinants of health and the chicken and the egg as sort of interplay between those. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. And I think there are, it is complicated. It's not simply environment. There's so many other things that go into that. And you know that because you see people who grow up in terrible environments and end up thriving and doing amazing things. So it's not neither your zip code or your genomic code is determinative. They don't explain all of the variants and outcomes, that's for sure. And they probably work together in interesting ways we don't fully understand. I think part of what goes into this conversation, though, John, is like, okay, so what can you do about it? And it's really hard for us to change someone's genetics. You can, I guess technically you can do that today with CRISPR, but you're not going to do it in a way that is going to have a real impact on their how they think, feel, and behave. Whereas you can modify their environment in all kinds of ways. And so part of why this conversation about social determinants, I think, can be helpful, is it does focus us on what can we change, what's modifiable, what should we be thinking about for trying to either push the prevention agenda, like giving people better environments in which to grow up, or even pushing the recovery agenda, making sure that people have good places, safe places in which to recover. And that's a lot easier, I think, than going after the fundamental biology.
So we have time for just one more question, and we're going to go to Ab. So Ab, over to you for the final question.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Justin. And thank you, Dr. Insel, for this wonderful discussion. I want to take you back to something you said earlier that I found really significant, in that majority of those that are suffering from severe mental illness generally develop it by the age of 23, if I'm remembering that correctly. So that being said, what can be done in terms of what type of policies should be crafted to help identify the symptoms, and maybe could there be a more preventative approach taken so that those who do develop at such a young age in their life are directed to the proper channels?
There's a lot of science on trying to find the earliest signals for psychotic illnesses, at age 15 or 16. A couple of years before. We know that most kids have symptoms and they have things that are changing. We actually have a name for that now. We call it the prodrome. Instead of a syndrome, it's called the prodrome. You're not really psychotic, but you're beginning to socially withdraw. You're probably having sleep problems, and you're beginning to really focus on some pretty bizarre ideas. And you can see that in the websites that people go to as they get into the prodrome. It really changes. We're not very good at detecting that, and we're not exactly sure what to do at that early stage. There's a lot of science right now being funded to try to figure that question out. Some of the things that you might think would help, like maybe giving antipsychotic medication at that early stage, it actually probably makes things worse, not better. So that's not the answer. There's a lot of interest in certain kinds of cognitive therapy, maybe. And I must say there's also interest in going further upstream and making sure that you can provide sort of universal supports for students. There's a program in Australia that I like a lot called future proofing. Future proofing is for every 8th grader in New South Wales, in the whole state, where they learn about what are the signs and symptoms to be concerned about, what can you do about them, and then they also learn a lot about what sometimes in this country is called social and emotional learning. How do you manage impulsive behavior? How do you manage your emotions? You learn the language for talking about this and understanding this. We haven't done a very good job of educating middle schoolers or high schoolers in the United States about these kinds of, I'll call them brain capital issues, or giving people what they need to really thrive in the new economy. Other countries have been better in doing this. And I think we've got an opportunity now to say, can we use the school system as a place where people can get some of these soft skills? So you build in resilience, you build in more information, more awareness of what to be concerned about, and how to get treatment much earlier. I'm hoping we'll see this. It's one of the recommendations in that action plan that the White House has put out. And we're seeing some states, particularly in Michigan and California, a few other places, where this is becoming a priority. But we've got a lot of catching up to do. There's a lot more we could do in this kind of early prevention, early intervention space. Thanks so much for sharing that experience. I think it really helped all of us to understand just what we're talking about here. Very helpful.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Dr. Insel for his time and expertise, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited down version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with real audience questions. For information on how to join us, past episodes, and more, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Friday featuring Michael Oren, who's the former ambassador of Israel to the United States. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning, on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.